Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I'm here with Andy Root or Andrew Root, who's
Andy couldn't make it.
yeah. Andy couldn't make it. Also, Andy's new hairdo here got it got it all close on the sides there.
Yeah, just got a cut. So this is like my fall cut. You know what I mean? Like my at the beginning of the school year, get your hair cut kind of deal. So yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
well, I'm glad. I'm glad you got it all nice and ready. I have to wait till kids go back to school to get haircuts,
Yeah.
and I've got the I just lifted weights an hour ago haircut. It's a special one where um, I dry it, but there's still all the residue of sweat and chalk, and
Yeah, this
like
is
the
nice.
end chalk.
Really? So you really were lifting weights?
Oh yeah, I lift a lot of
Okay.
weights,
Wow.
kettlebells specifically. In
Wow.
the last 2 years, I've done it at least 4 days a week for like an hour, and I set a new personal record. I've lost 50 pounds, 8 belt sizes, and
Wow.
5% body weight
Wow.
in kettlebells over the last 2 years. So
I'm impressed, Tripp. That's great.
I mostly wanted to do it so we could wrestle in January when I'm at Luther. For those that don't know, Andy is professor at Luther Seminary, where I'm a visiting professor, and so this January, maybe we could just wrestle. That like people say like, oh, what do the students do when they're there for intensives at night? And um, you know, they haven't had a salon for a lecture series. We did that, but
Mhm.
have they had faculty wrestling?
I would doubt they've had faculty wrestling, and I don't know. I may be sick that day because
Maybe
with
sick.
with all this kettlebell talk, I don't think it would go well for me. So
Well, we're going to talk about Hartmut Rosa and what it's like to think with Hartmut Rosa, sociologist today. And in part, it's because, well, Andy and I both like reading him. We've done a class that spent quite a bit of time together a few years ago on his work and Charles Taylor's work. But on top of that, in September, Hartmut Rosa is coming to an event that Andy is helping put together at Princeton. And we want to lure you to come hang out with us there. And the link is in here in the chat. You can see it, but also to be on the post for this episode and things. Um, so maybe before we kind of like dig into ideas that both of us find fascinating from a sociologist, introduce us to him and why a German sociologist is going to come hang out at Princeton um, with a bunch of theologians.
yeah, I'm really not sure why he's going to do it. I have no idea why he agreed to say yes to this. Other than in conversations with him has said some theologians have been interested in his work, German theologians particularly, and now English speaking theologians, and he's really surprised by that. Not because he's not a person of faith. Though he doesn't want to talk about it in a very kind of German way, he's not all that interested in, sharing his testimony or anything like that. But he does play the organ at his church in the Black Forest, and goes to a Lutheran State Church. And as his latest publication that we'll talk a bit about, Why Democracy Needs Religion, is really clear that he thinks there's quite a societal value towards faith and religion. And yeah, so I don't know why. I personally just found his work just so incredibly rich, and I'm a little bit drawn to kind of German philosophical thought and German social theory that's born out of that. But one of the things that I think really connects it to theologians, and he says this about himself, that he's one of the dying breeds of big idea sociology, which does bring it kind of in the purviews of philosophy and maybe even, because of philosophy, maybe in big questions of ontology and in human action and human action next to kind of moral frameworks and things like that. So particularly in the English speaking world, but maybe even more so in America, kind of sociology has not been big idea sociology, like thinking like, what is modernity? What is going on? What's really happening here? It's been more granular, kind of thinking about doing studies on, uh, maybe it's on demographic issues, or maybe it's, we've seen all these on how many people are leaving church or whatever in the sociology of religion, or things like that, or you know consumer realities. It's been more kind of empirical studies, less these are the big currents of what it means to live in modernity, and this is what modernity is. It's been more looking at kind of slightly more narrow, well, maybe very very narrow kind of phenomenon of like what happens to school children when they have soda at lunch.
Mhm.
It's been more of kind of what it's been focused on, but he's really focused on kind of big idea sociology, and I think that gives it real hooks for theologians, and maybe moral philosophers as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and in my experience, he's one of the as a thinker is definitely picked up by people cross disciplines. Similar to someone like Bruno Latour, who you're like, well, what exactly? Where does he teach? Because he ends up at conferences across different disciplines. Charles Taylor is similar in that way, and I think you're right. Part of what happens in well, it's encouraged, I think, by the whole form of the university at this point, is to get increasingly narrow, specific, and precise, and then to articulate your understanding of the narrow, particular, and precise part of the world in things that can be quantitatively assessed, and that the university produces knowledge in this kind of way is actually an example of modernity and its problem that Rosa raises, and one of the ways someone like him ends up really resonating. That's one of his resonances category for him. Didn't think of it that way when I said it, but one of the reasons I think someone like him resonates with people across disciplines um, is he has the kind of uh, intellectual confidence to tell a big story that makes that gives like a framing narrative for all these little things that in particular his field raises, and then when he tells a big story, all of a sudden there are people in other fields, like take your own work engaging his, thinking about how does modernity and its drives reshape how the church understands itself, how does it reshape the human being and what it means to be a self in that task, and those kind of big picture reflections um, are really a way of animating kind of creative cross disciplinary conversations. And so, what I'm excited about the event at Princeton is unlike trying to track down papers and lecture videos from when he hangs out with other disciplines. This is with a bunch of theologians.
Hmm.
So say a bit about the event, because
Yeah.
yes, if you're in the Princeton area, you might want to come hang out in person, but you can go digitally for $7.50, which is just kind of wild. I don't know, like, why not $7.77? But
Yeah.
say a bit about the event, because
Yeah.
you can join live, and also you'll get the archive of the videos and things, and hopefully we do a decent enough job to you feel the lure.
Yeah, well, it's a kind of three different groups putting on this event. The impetus of it comes out of this grant that I have at Luther Seminary, through the Lilly Endowment, which is looking kind of really grabbing Rose's work and Taylor's work, and kind of thinking about the pastoral practice right now, and thinking just about pastoral identity and congregational life right now with a group of pastors. But we wrote in that we would do this conference kind of with scholars, and then invited Rosa, and he showed up. So we're partnering with Princeton Seminary's Bart Center, the Carl Bart Center there at Princeton, and the great folks there helping put this on, and then with the University of Aberdeen and their Protestant Theology Center, their Center for Protestant Theology. So those are the kind of the three different groups, and it is a kind of cross Atlantic experience. Bringing Rosa in and focusing on this German thinker, but then we'll have some folks from the States, of course, but then also some UK folks coming to be in conversation. And it really is really broadly interdisciplinary across theology too. We have some
Yeah.
practical theologians. We do have a sociologist of religion who will be there, but we also have biblical scholars, systematicians involved too. So constructive theologians. So I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. The price is this is the grossly capitalistic logic of escalation that we'll get into here in Rosa's work, that talk about performative contradiction. But the price is, so you can stream it, like you said, and it's low because we've entered into a partnership with Baker Books, Baker Academic, and if you do go on, I think for people who show up, it's only $50 to show up, and I think they're going to give you a free book, and then they've made the streaming cost. We had it at $10, and they decided to, take $2.50 off. So that's why it's that strange number. So yeah, so there'll be the option to stream it, and then to show up. So we'd like to get about 100 people to be at Princeton, and another couple hundred people to stream it, and that's what we're hoping for. We do think it's going to be an interesting conversation, and I think another element that's going to make it fascinating is that we're going to kind of set up pastoral practice and kind of church life at the center of this thing. So it's not just a kind of academic theology conversation, but bringing some, I think, really established scholars to think about the practice of ministry through Hartmut Rosa's work. So I think that's the selling point of it.
Yeah. And if regular podcast listeners will know Gerardo Marti, who's a sociologist of religion, that'll be there. Obviously, Hartmut Rosa will. Also, John Swinton's been on the podcast, who's a theologian. He was on talking about theology and disabilities and time and memory on the podcast, but he's from Aberdeen, and he'll be there. Miroslav Wolf will be there, who's been on the podcast before. So if you're, if this is new and you're interested, those are people who y'all have all heard before. And Andy's going to be there. So
I'll be there.
Yeah. And you can see if he has any extrovert energy at the end of the day.
Yeah, you can watch me in the morning, be willing to talk to you, and in the afternoon and evening be in a corner.
Yeah. Andy's like, I don't know.
Positions.
If you talk to Tripp, I think he wants to wrestle. If you just go find him.
That's right.
Okay, so I think it might be fun. There's kind of like two constellations of different ideas of his that are even mentioned in the name of the event itself: the church, the pastor, and resonance in an accelerated age. And he came to prominence within the Guild with his description of modernity. And one of those lines that he's used both in print and in lectures is his definition of modernity. So I thought I'd read it, and then you kind of like start unpacking it and such, and we'll dig into what he's describing, and then we can do the same with resonance, and then we can talk about some of the possible interactions and such. But he says that a society can be called modern when it's made of when it's a mode of stabilization is dynamic, when it systematically requires material growth, technological acceleration, and cultural innovation to reproduce its structure and to maintain the institutional status quo. Now that sounds like a sociologist.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it's a really important definition of what it means to be modern. And this is one of the interesting things I think about Rosa. Like I said in our grant, we've been working both Charles Taylor's ideas and then Rosa's ideas. And one of the fascinating things about these two very different thinkers, and one of the places they're linked, is that Rosa wrote his dissertation on Taylor. He wrote it under a guy named Hannett, who's a well-known German was one of Habermas's students, but he wrote it under him, but he wrote it on Taylor. But the difference in their thoughts is that when you read Rosa, you just kind of get it. You think you get it. And Taylor, it takes you a while because you have to figure out, like, what does all this mean? What is an immanent frame? What is cross pressure? What is a porous self? And Rosa's telling you things that you can really feel, like that the world is speeding up and going faster and faster. So part of the danger of Rosa is you feel like you know him immediately, like, oh, I get it, I got it. And there's more going on here. And one of the things in that definition of modernity that's really at stake here is he thinks what makes a society modern is that it has to stabilize itself through processes of growth, acceleration, and innovation. And that's what really turned me on to Rosa the first time I I read him was I read a paper that he had done, and he said something similar to this. And I just thought, my gosh, in every denomination that I visit, what they think will save the church, or when they think about the church doing bad, is it needs growth. And if that doesn't feel, like a good word to use because we're afraid of church growth or we're afraid of the prosperity gospel or something, then we start using words like innovation and acceleration, and or just we need to do better, we need to do more. And I thought there was something incredibly prophetic that he's getting at here. But he does think what it means to be modern is that the only way that your institutional structure or your collective in any way has a life, will be stable, is if it continues to grow, if it continues to go faster and accelerate, and it continues to innovate not even out of a sense of kind of faithful response to the situation or to the concrete human beings before us, but simply have to innovate to stay stable, to stay in the same place. And so those are really important, because I think, in conversations we had within the church and within pastoral ministry 20 years ago, and Tripp, you did a whole podcast on like the emergent church movement, like the inherent definitions of modernity in those conversations were definitions he wants to oppose, which he thinks
Right.
we kind of thought like we're leaving modernity because we're now looking at different kind of forms of legitimation, and we're looking at different normative structures. So there was a kind of holding on to a kind of post-structuralist kind of definition of what it meant to be modern, and therefore leaving the modern realities. And Rosa doesn't come from that tradition. He doesn't believe that. He believes what makes us modern is this form of how institutions stabilize themselves, not how we think of certain forms of legitimation or certain forms of kind of normative structure in leaving those, that you remain modern even if you're looking for those different forms of legitimation and structure, but nevertheless think that your movement can only exist if it continues to grow. So you need to have bigger conferences, you need to have bigger book deals, you need to think about kind of personality capital makes you modern, even if you want to be something beyond modern. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic he's getting at, that to me seems to kind of land in the, I don't know, the existential algorithm of so many of our denominations right now, is that in the fret of decline, we try to play this game, this modern game, this game of modernity that I think Rosa thinks is fundamentally acidic and problematic.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, even there, right? Like about how his definition of modernity would render a different kind of postmodernity, right? Like to understand modernity, what the normal trope as it's played out in church spaces, and also plenty of places within the academy. But if we're just thinking about church spaces, is that there's this shift in epistemology, that the content of the faith, there's a shift maybe in our confidence about it, our certainty about it, our access to this content, or how we hold the content. The content becomes a thing, and he's giving a form description of modernity. Not, he draws a form content distinction. So there's like different kinds of content, but the form, the one that is established just by participation in modernity in the world we live in, with the demands of existence, which he names three levels right in there. The kind of like demand for material growth, when you think of like our economic context. The technologically, we're always trying to innovate, accelerate these kinds of things. We want to get more efficient. We got to, this kind of drive, and that generates a need for constant innovation, often for innovation's sake. And he'll point out places where we'll innovate, even if it's not even following the laws of the market and this kind of thing. And I think drawing that form content distinction is helpful, because modernity is the form of life in which you are always already embedded in a stream of existence, where to be stable, you have to be going the direction of modernity, and always just getting a bit faster.
Mm-hmm.
An image I've been thinking about. I'm working on this talk for. I did a version of it. I was on kind of like process engagement with Rose's stuff and Taylor's things at a conference this summer, and I've been writing it out now. In the image that's come up to me about what he calls dynamic stabilization is like an above ground kiddie pool, where the first kid gets in and they kind of start going in a circle, and then anyone else that gets in, the only thing you can do that doesn't generate intense difficulty is to join the direction of the whirlpool. And the only thing where you don't get resistance, if you slow down, you start to feel it. If you turn around, you're going to, your legs are going to go out. The only thing you can do is to join the whirlpool and at least keep pace and speed up, right? And if you take the form or the kind of the interrelational web of modernity, then we all know this experience. We think about it when we have our kid. Like, I mean, you and I've had these conversations when we were youth ministers and when we work with youth ministers. What is the parents' primary thing? They're like, we need them to be really good students. They have to get ahead. They got to get into the right school. And we got to do these things. And now we're worried about debt. And now there's all this big, this giant fear overcoming us. And yet those parents are the same ones sitting there being like, I'm burnt out. I have no time to do anything. I just wish I got to have time with my kids. When I retire, I can finally survive and crescendo into finally getting to be a free human and enjoy that good life. Right? If you are just thinking about the content and not the form, or you're thinking about like the particular expression in the whirlpool and not the energy of the relations, then I think we end up misdiagnosing the problem by making it a substantial problem. Like, here's the problem: this belief, or this particular economic policy, or this solution to a climate crisis, or this way to fix our family. But if you don't acknowledge and address the way that we inherited a whirlpool of pressure and inertia that will, by its very nature, orient your life in ways that don't lead to our own flourishing, the planet, or our relations with other humans, then go ahead, go try to fix it. And if you think whatever particular substantial bits of it, if you deconstruct them, you're becoming postmodern, you're missing the point. It's the water, it's not the things, or it's the relations, not the substance, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and where your analogy really works for him, I think, too, is the idea of being in a whirlpool, just going in a circle and not going anywhere. I mean, part of the assertion of the modern project is that you actually are advancing and you're growing and you're getting more reach and you're going, like all this walking maybe feel a little bit like a spiral, but you actually are advancing and going somewhere. But Rose's point now is that what becomes really insidious is that you aren't going anywhere. You are just stuck in that circle. Like maybe you have some video screens that make you appear like you're going somewhere, but you're not going anywhere, and you're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
But then there's something more at stake, is that somewhere, and this really is adding to your story now, Tripp, but there is the fear that if we all stop, we'll get sucked to some abyss. Like it will, even if we wanted to stop. And we see this with parents, Tripp, that we work with all the time, or youth workers will talk about parents who we work with that will say things like, well, I would like not to be traveling baseball or AAU basketball, but if we don't, our kid falls behind. Like, even when you realize that you are stuck in this acceleration machine, in this dynamic stabilization process, the feeling, whether it's true or not, maybe it's just a pure ideological reality, but maybe not too, that you worry that you all of a sudden will, you'll be sucked to some abyss. Your kid's future will be annihilated in some way. So Rosa has this sense that we're trying to go faster and faster just to stay in the same place, because if we don't, we will get washed out by the current.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what I think he means by dynamic stabilization, right? Like, stabilization actually requires a whole lot of energy, and in fact, an increasing amount of energy, right, to keep it going.
Yeah.
But that also leads to a frenetic standstill, is one of his other phrases he uses. And you can just think of it when you're sitting out. If you're the parent and you're watching them, and like the little kid gets in, and you're like, oh dear God, I hope he doesn't get swallowed under and drown in the whirlpool, and all these things are going through your head. And then you're sitting there just kind of stable going, at what point do y'all decide y'all don't want to do this anymore? And I think part of what modernity has done is it's come to occupy so much of our existence that a world outside of it is hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And I think that the one of the gifts, his description, which is extremely thick, he's laid it out not just in books, in talks, and has come back to it over and over again from different angles, is it actually gives you a sense that that when you recognize the nature of dynamic stabilization, it generates a mode of relating to the world that's inherently aggressive. And then kind of the normal trope that I think religious people, when you look at it, look, it's like, oh no, look at this, look at modernity, all these people wanting to be greedy, and greed's a problem, and greed's bad. But the moment, and I discovered this as clergy with a large number of one percenters that work in the military industrial complex and aerospace and technology in Los Angeles, they are not sitting there thinking, or they're not being driven by greed. They're being driven by fear of ultimately becoming a no one, of being left out. And now everything they're doing is what's celebrated, in the 80s
Yeah.
movies of like rah rah rah. But I think he's pointing out that that there's actually been a shift, that the very same activities have shifted from even a kind of desire for more now to a fear of being left behind. And
Mhm.
that kind of fear, that kind of identity crisis generates a spiritual crisis in a thick sense. Not like, oh, you got to talk to Jesus, though. I
Yeah.
mean, you can, but
Yeah.
that's a cultural, societal level spiritual crisis.
Yeah, I mean, he really does think, and I think this is fascinating too to think about in relation to pastors, that the way that this dynamic stabilization works, one of the reasons that we have to be really careful of it, and maybe it just doesn't become a kind of academic thing, like, well, isn't that too bad? At a large frame, but it doesn't get kind of down to our lives, is that he thinks it will put us in a relationship with the world that will be fundamentally alienating at some point. At some point, being in that it's kind of fun for a little bit, and when you like are with the other kids going around, you start to master it and you feel like some kind of agency within it. But the problem is you can never stop. And I was, again, thinking we're pushing your analogy too far, but as a parent who's had an above ground pool for a while and the kids do that, one of the things you're the most frightened of is when they stop. Because then all of a sudden the current shift, and that's when the seams rip on the pool, and that's when somebody gets impaled by a metal pole. Like all the bad stuff, all the apocalyptic stuff can happen when the momentum slows. And it's just no wonder that across our pop culture, we've been enamored for 2-3 decades now, at least 2 decades, with apocalyptic dystopian literature and movies and TV shows, because we do have this sense that, can you keep going? Can you keep this pace going? And if it ever stops for whatever reason, it could lead to just utter mayhem. But one of the things that will lead to that, I think, is fascinating with Rosa. It will exhaust you. It will make, eventually you mastered that walking. It was fun to be with a group of people. Now you're just exhausted. And if you stop, there's a problem. But eventually it will lead you to have an aggressive stance towards the world and towards this whole experience. And it will lead you to be massively, if you have any sense of privilege, it will lead you to be massively interested in control, that you will try to control the world because of this fear, like you're saying, that if it becomes out of control, people get hurt, things disappear, apocalypse comes. And so now you have to be in utter control. But what's fascinating about Rosa, and this does link to Taylor, is he has this kind of anthropology born from Taylor that is quite positive, that no one creates this system of dynamic stabilization because they hate the world, because there's some evil cabal somewhere that wants, us all marching in step. It all happens out of desires for the good. I mean, that's kind of Taylor's philosophical perspective here, that Rosa holds to, that human agency is born out of people's ethical drives, these moral believing animals that want something good. And so he thinks like this sense of controlling the world that modernity gives us comes out of the good. Like we think, oh, those mountains speak to me, those mountains are beautiful, what if I could get up there really easily? And then you think, well, what if we paved a road up there? And then you think, well, what if we had a restaurant? And you end up putting all these things there so you can actually get and have this experience with the world, but it ends up in trying to control it, in trying to be able to get up to those mountains within 20 minutes. You create all the conditions to destroy the very thing that spoke to you in the first place. And all of a sudden those mountains don't speak, or they're polluted, or they're stripped of what was beautiful in the pines and all that stuff, so that you can continue to create these structures of trying to reach the world. So control for him becomes a big fear, that one of the ways that we actually end up deadening the world in this dynamic stabilization process is by trying to control all of our experiences of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and and um, now the examples and stuff we've kind of mentioned are more the ones that come up in a congregational context, but that kind of mode where there's this kind of intense acceleration that's a part of dynamic stabilization generates a competitive relations and a goal of control. He will give examples across different features of modernity to show, like, take how science has changed from its early emergence to the
Mhm.
present. The scientific exploration of the world has shifted from understanding regularities to then classifying, organizing things, to then controlling things, then to in all those things. What's it ultimately do? It ends up silencing a large part of nature and turning it into a resource,
Mhm.
something that is a part of us. And that, even that logic right there, right, that turning it into something you want to control to gain. Think of just even our own time, like in the workplace. Oh, we need to be more efficient. Let's now like track what people are doing on their computers. Let's oh, but also, what about, we got to have healthy workers? Let's give them watches where they can track their
Mhm.
steps, so then they can internalize a good
Yeah.
guilt complex and make sure they're healthy and good workers. And
Right.
maybe should remind them of screen time, but we want them to have screen time because why should you ever have any of your attentive energy not being mined for information so we can do targeted ads? So what happens when you zone out? You're scrolling things on algorithms so a system can know you, and then it can give you targeted ads, right? There's like very few spaces where your own life is not having to generate something for the engine of modernity. If you think of I mean, those are more like technological reorientations of our life. It comes to what? Control your health, control your relations. We mediate almost all chance meetings that you can't control, of meeting other people.
Mhm.
So and then you see it playing out economically. You can even see it in politics, and the way laws have changed, where kind of like regulating and the protection of rights have now become tools to control an increasing number of masters, and then impose cultural, economic, and like ideological norms on your other. Right. So
Mhm.
like this kind of aggression that comes out of his account of modernity is one where the I think the big ugh that so many people feel, and this is actually something you saw have seen in both parties' conventions. People point to that icky feeling or the problem that we feel or this thing we have to get beyond. Now, their temptation is to locate a particular problem in it and not acknowledge the situation, but everyone nods their heads, right? So when we think of our political parties now, we want to use all of our control and grab as much power within quote unquote legal means and get our will done. And then when it's not responsive to our needs and doesn't hear what we want to burn it down. Our day-to-day life, the rhythm of life, the demands of work, the attempt to have a life, and all these things, we have burnout. And then our relationship to nature is to say, let's burn it up. That's what we're
Mhm.
seeing. And we don't want, everyone knows those things are wrong. Burning up, burning down, burning out, all of it is not good for flourishing. And we're like, yeah, but
Mhm.
well, yeah, but dynamic stabilization. But if I don't, I'll be behind.
Right.
And everyone knows everyone's already a slave to the
Yeah.
inertia, to the energy.
Yeah, but and like you had said earlier, it's structural. It's not just agency. It's so it's not just these are all just dumb lemmings who are serving dynamic stabilization. It's that we do feel like, okay, if the economy doesn't grow, then tax revenue is down, and if revenue is down, then all this happens, and people lose their jobs, and then this occurs. So there is this deep fear that if you don't keep up, then the whole system will come undone. And I think Rosa finds that really kind of fascinating on a structural level, but he does want to know what that does to us. Like, how does that lead us to relate to the world in a certain way? That we have to do this, and can we imagine a way out of this? And yeah, I mean, but it is a deeply it's a deeply existential issue, which I think again is why maybe theologians and philosophers, at least some of us, resonate with what he's doing, because there is a deep kind of existential overtone here of what it means to be living in this world and to be modern.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, knowing that we're trying to get people to come spend days hanging out with Rosa. We don't have to go into tons more about this, or you can go watch the class of Andy and I that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
spending quite a bit of time doing this. But um, uh, now after uh, both developing his theory of acceleration, dynamic stabilization, how there's this alienation and antagonism and aggressive posture that's just kind of orients us to the world within modernity. Um, like when we get to those places, and I think right there you're getting at it, that um, we can we have an increasing number of people that recognize we don't like it. It's not good for our well-being, for our future generations, for our non-human neighbors, for state relations. Like the number of reasons we should pick something different are there, and yet no one knows how to no one knows how to move out of it. That kind of energy has led him to think about what are the spaces, how would a sociologist describe spaces that aren't imperialized by modernity's drive for acceleration? Like what are those spaces? And he develops his concept of resonance, um, which is in a ginormous book. There's also a little book called Uncontrollability of the World, which is more of a summary of it. It includes some other fun asides and references to Schleiermacher. But I know in y'all's project that this is a part of, y'all created some really cool kind of like summary videos. And one of them, right, is more acceleration focused. Another one looking at resonance. So describe that and kind of introduce us to what he's meaning by
Yeah.
resonance and the why he wants to attend to it.
Yeah, and this is why you need to attend the conversation too, because like we said, Rosa gives you these hooks, like so acceleration, feeling like the dynamic stabilization. Those are all kind of weird words, but it doesn't take much to feel that, to feel like you're on a treadmill and you're just trying to stay in place. But he wants to respond to that, and this is what becomes fuzzier, and it's worth coming and listening to him talk about this, because I think especially as Americans, we fall into a couple of traps here, is that he realized, and I may have even said this in our class, so there's a pitch to listen to our class, but that he, as all the acceleration stuff came out and he was really naming the problem of modernity, he became known in the German press as the slowdown guru. And yet he felt really uncomfortable about that, because he didn't think, I mean, he thought maybe we do need to slow down, but there was something in him that thought, like, God, I just don't know about that. And he did come to realize that the reason he was uncomfortable with it is that slowing down would never solve this problem. That this problem of dynamic stabilization, both as a form of agency and as a form of structure, is just too insidious, and that you just simply checking out, it wouldn't work. Just simply trying to slow down won't work. And all of our experiences of slowing down end up colonized by this acceleration, like our retirements, like our vacations, like our weekends. Those all get overtaken by this. So his point was we needed a different form of relating. We just need a very different way of relating. So as a sociologist, thinking about how human beings act societally, this made a lot of sense. But for theologians, I mean, there's a lot at stake here too. How do we think about what human action is? I think theologically we try to think about what is human action next to the divine action, next to practices of worship, things like that. But there's a connection there. So his response to this, his response to the acceleration, to the dynamic stabilization, is this thing he calls resonance. Because his point is, we do have these experiences in the world. All of this dynamic stabilization, all of this speeding up, all this drive, you must accelerate. You must even accelerate your own. You must innovate. You must innovate, and you must even innovate your own self. Those experiences are there, and maybe they're weighted in modernity, but we also have these other experiences where we're interrupted by beauty, where we feel connected to something, where we feel pulled into a conversation, and where it doesn't feel like time is controlling us, and that we're being kind of overcome by time, but where we feel in it and feels full. And so this is what he means by resonance, these experiences where we feel like something resonates with us. And he really is using an analogy that I think is really rich for theological discussion, that's really word and response. So his sociology, if you ask me, and Rosa may not agree with this, though you should come to the conference because I will ask him to respond to this. There is a kind of certain early Protestant Lutheran dynamic at play with Rosa. Like Taylor is just Catholic, and to really understand him, you have to understand that he's a Catholic, and there's this kind of Catholic sacramentality to his perspective. Rosa's he's born and bred, or at least he's in a cultural context where Protestantism is everywhere. And he has this kind of Lutheran word response kind of dynamic at play. So he really thinks that the kind of action we need is one where we have the agency to give word and get response, or the world speaks to us and we respond to it. And he wants to call this resonance, this experience of being in this kind of relationship with the world where we hear it speak to us again, where something in the music speaks to us. But at its core, human relationships kind of can speak to us again. So resonance is broad, but what's really important, I think, for pastors and particularly Americans, is we always want to default into thinking of it as a psychological category, like it's a feeling of something. And for him, it's not necessarily a feeling. It does have feeling to it. That's one of the dynamics of it. One of the dimensions of it is there's feeling, but it's really a way of relating. It's a way of relationship to the world. And so that's his response is this kind of reality. And he does think God is that in our relationships with God, we can have this word response kind of dynamic, but he also wants to take it in multiple different kind of axes and directions of, it's a piece of art that speaks to us. It can be playing a musical instrument, like all those experiences of feeling, of feeling played and like you're playing. I mean, there's a kind of dynamic of music and maybe even a sport at play here with him. So that's what he means by resonance. But it's straightforward, I think, but it's hard to describe. Like I'm out on the road all the time trying to describe what this experience of resonance is, and you almost have to show it more than tell it. And yet we all have these kind of experiences. But Rose is a good German social theorist and wrote 450 pages on something that you really have to see more than you can describe. And yet I think he's described it. But it's worth listening to him talk about it because it's really rich, and also it really can get fuzzy and blurry, though it's always experiential in some way that also grounds it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, one of the things that helped get at what he's describing on resonance is how the in contrast to what modernity's agenda of control, is that these are encounters that are definitionally uncontrollable. And part of what we do in modernity for control is put more and more life under the reign of language and math, and depending on the realm. But sometimes he will describe, like, the problem that we get with language is that language puts us in a dynamic where there's a doer and someone that's done to. There's the active and the passive. And then we use this tool to describe all these other parts of life where all of a sudden the symbolic and the poetic and the arts and things come in, namely where it's something in between that, like dancing or listening to music or these kinds of things, that to participate in whatever it is, you're definitely not doing it. But it's not just doing you because you're a part of it. It's between, and our language doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And when society, um, uh, when the kind of energy that takes that control, using logos, language, to control the world, reality, experience, self, nature, divine, as that became more and more intense, then the very spaces that are uncontrolled, the ones where you're neither doing nor being done to, like, they dissipate, they get
Mm-hmm.
relativized. And when he describes that to me, like, he uses feeling in a very similar way to Schleiermacher, where if you just think they mean feelings, you don't understand either one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Like the feeling of absolute dependence, which he makes reference to, along with kind of the existential seizure. Like footnotes Bultmann's,
Mm-hmm.
Rudolf Bultmann's, like, talking about the event of the gospel. But it's only yes, you're seized by the divine, but it's only the gospel because it's for you, right? Like,
Mhm.
anyway, which is if you're going to be a German who
Yeah.
likes playing organ, it's not surprising that you have footnotes, the Schleiermacher and Boltmann. Uh, but to me, that's one of the things that that shows up in the conversation of resonance is it gives a term that then there are all these different axes like that you were getting at, where there are elements of those where you go, oh yeah, I know that, like, and but to say you know it, you have to tell a particular story for yourself, right?
Mhm.
So if you think, oh well, like it has these different axes of resonance. So there's like the social axis, which is about when resonance happens towards people. Um, and if we nod, we're like, yeah, that happens. But then we only know it because we have going to tell a particular story.
Mhm.
And the same with like a material axis, relationships to where objects and things occasion it, and we give a particular one. And what's fascinating, if you name an event where the people, or you could describe a material object and these kinds of things, we could have both been present for it, Andy, and one of us is giving it as
Right.
an example, and the other one's like, that's what happened when Tripp and Andy were talking about Rosa. I was thinking it's almost 5 o'clock, so I could start drinking because it was boring. And the others are like, no, no, no. I think I finally get what they meant by modernity. It's a
Those other people turned this off a long time ago. Yeah.
yeah, but and then again the one of the other axes is the self, and it takes these different shapes
Mhm.
of both like the self in the sense of like your body, but
Mhm.
also uh body, mind, and he recently in his newest book says but the self is also the story, the ability to narrate where you've come from and where you're going, like biography, but it's biography of a narrative with direction,
Mhm.
and then the existential axis, which is like more ultimate reality of sorts, which could be connected to like God, life, nature, history, universe, and such. But you know what? Um, one of the things about his concept of resonance that I find interesting, and I'm interested in what you say, because when he said that is that God is a symbol of residence at the heart of the universe. Um, one, like again, a nice Lutheran Paul Tillich would just want to retweet it. Uh, yeah, but underneath it, when you hear him give these contrasts, it's not like God, and therefore I'm going to give you the correct theology and give you the
Yeah.
content of this. It's he contrasts it with, um, do you exist? Is your being in the world one where there are depths of meaning and value that we are woven into the relationships that neither come from you or are determined by you and escape your own possession and imagination, or are you in a kind of lifeless world where
Mhm.
anything that amounts to meaning and purpose are human constructs and as frail as your own finitude, and the most honest description of reality is one that is as lifeless as an animal under a microscope being dissected, right? Like, so that kind of symbolic dimension, the unconditioned or the infinite, God. He makes some people just say the word universe, and then you go, but that's not even how universe works. Like, no scientist describes the universe giving it teleological reasoning, and you just do because you're uncomfortable saying God.
Yeah.
Uh, like, how do you see that? Because I find that to be one of the places that might be interesting, um, when taking resonance and talking to theologians and to clergy, because it's that broad and thick account of God is not the one that confessional traditions have stewarded.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that connects with me, that I do think that Rosa, there is a deep kind of, well, there's a theological commitment, I think, at play that he never feels like he can explicitly say. So that's also why you should, beam in and see how he responds to all these theologians and where he can be more explicit. Because actually, in chapter 14 of Resonance, where he talks about this logic of escalation and really develops dynamic stabilization, the example he gives of certain groups or collectives that don't have to concede to dynamic stabilization is religious communities. Though he's never obviously never spent much time in American Protestantism, because American Protestantism is completely overtaken by dynamic stabilization. But he's kind of thinking of like medieval Christendom and kind of thinking of Catholic communities, like he gave the lecture series that became the new book, Why Democracy Needs Religion. He's thinking of those kind of realities, and he is getting to what you had said leading into this, is that there are these experiences we have that I think for him goes back to some kind of sense of what it means to be made in the image of God, or to be made almost in the image of resonance, if you will, of this kind of reality of resonance, made to resonate with God, in some kind of form of discourse. But it is a kind of form of discourse where you are in what he calls, I don't think he develops this in Resonance. I think these are more new ideas, but this menial passive place, this place of being, like you're saying, not the one doing or done to, but you are just somehow in the middle of this. And I find that fascinating. And this is probably another conversation we can have at another time, Trip. But in some ways, that connects so much with my understandings of what Luther is getting at, where like Luther kind of thinks the way of action and the way of contemplation, neither of them can work. And so Oswald Bayer, the great 20th century Tübingen Luther scholar, would talk about Luther's perspective as this way of passivity. That justification is in the sense of passivity, of this word and response. And I think he's kind of getting at that. I think Rosa's trying to develop a kind of social theory inside modernity that ennobles at the very least, but creates maybe a whole architecture of passivity as a kind of form of faithful action, or a form of lived action. And it is a distinctly theological perspective, I think, maybe with a lowercase t, because for Rosa, these dynamics that you've been getting at as well about resonance is that it has to be uncontrollable. So I don't think we've mentioned these like four dynamics he has, that that there is both kind of emotion and affection play in. So it's not just enough to feel something, but there also is a sense of being pulled in to having affection for something. And then there's a dynamic of being transformed by it. You've had a resonant encounter if you feel like you've left it changed in some way, at least some small way. But then the third dynamic of this is that you can't control it. And so this becomes really the moral heart of resonance. So I've asked him this, that he thinks resonance is always good. It's always a good. There's no such thing as bad resonance. Which if you actually build bridges, you can have bad resonance like that. If you have enough bad resonance, it will crumble a bridge or something, So there is such a thing as bad resonance in a kind of natural acoustic, or I guess the reality of the wave of vibes work, and different things, and different I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, just the way that waves work. But
Yeah.
for Rosa, there's no such thing as negative resonance as he's developing it, that it's always a positive. And what keeps it always a good is that it's uncontrollable. So there's a sense, I want to almost make this argument that the first half of resonance is very Schleiermacher, and in some ways the second half is very Barthian, at least in this distinct assertion that it's uncontrollable, that you can't go into an experience and say, well, we're gonna have a resonance experience this Sunday. You can almost guarantee you won't if you try to create it. Now he does say you can do semi-controlled things, like all the classic Christian practices and prayer books and things like that are semi-controlled experiences of resonance. Like these are things through the tradition and that the community has done. But the minute you say this sermon or this prayer promises God will show up here, is the minute that you're not talking about God anymore.
Yeah,
That
they've
you're,
the rituals, habit, practices, and stuff function more as like habits of attunement,
yeah,
but it doesn't like introduce resonance. It doesn't,
yeah. It
and
doesn't enter you into that menial passive place where you feel where you feel spoken to and speaking at the same time, or you feel, played and like you're playing at the same time, that middle space, which I think at a deep level, we think kind of worship and life in the community is that, but you can't ever control that. You can only show up and put yourself in a certain position to receive it, a tradition given to you by your ancestors, by the tradition itself. But the minute you say, all we do is say the creed, or I'm the pastor, so when I preach the Bible, it is word of God, is the minute that you will not have resonance in that experience. So there is a certain kind of holy otherness to resonance too, that kind of reverberates a Bardian sensibility, which
And
was
and
needed
it's
since
sad.
this is sponsored by the Bard Center. I had
Yeah.
to say that, Tripp.
Well, it also, there can be a sabotage of it as well, right? Like part of, in the new book, the critiques of what the church has done, is he's like, you like, religious traditions are stewards of resonance and uncontrollability, and then y'all got modern, and y'all
Yeah,
got bad. You got rid of lots of art. You adopted the capitalist calendar, got rid of your feast days. Every day is the same day. Like, you could just go through the list,
yeah.
and um, you get
And
more
that's
and
where
more
he's very
particular.
unprotestant in
Yeah,
that way. Yeah, yeah.
you get more and more particular about your theological doctrines, and then those are like boundaries for how
Yeah.
God gets to work. And um, but I did notice when he went through in that book, the newest ones, that he picked very liturgical words as his second or third use for all four steps. So, like, norm in the concept of resonance, he that begins with affection, like that, where he talks about a subject is touched, moved, affected by something external, and he uses the phrase invocation,
Hmm.
in the new book, which is the beginning of the liturgical event.
Right.
Like, and it's precisely right. The invocation is the orienting and acknowledgement of another, whose presence you anticipate and make yourself available to. And then the second part, that kind of like a motive connection where the subject is responding by reaching out, that responsive reaction, he calls it encounter,
Mhm.
self-efficacy, and emphasizes in the new book the kind of reciprocity of listening and responding. And then transformation part three is that's not a hard word to turn into in a religious context, but a lot of times people, I think Protestants, have a tendency to think of the transformative encounter with the divine only under conditions of individual repentance, and so and he uses seizure,
Hmm.
not seizure like shaking, but like being seized.
Yeah.
The self the transformation is the seizing of the self by the other,
Hmm.
and it's a reciprocal act, but that actually involves a form of mutual transformation.
Hmm.
And and again, that's like those three events are the three first parts of every worship service.
Yeah.
There's like the invocation, there's the confession, and then there's the proclamation of the gospel. Uh, this
Hmm.
and then there's the uncontrollability, the fourth part, or unpredictability. And there in the text, he talks about is the grace of open endedness
Hmm.
for the religious life.
Yeah.
And and when you when he started using that phrase of open endedness and stuff around it, I just and that's a grace. I keep thinking of how um and I wanted to ask you this because you've actually read lots of religious memoirs for your most recent book.
Yeah.
But isn't it fascinating how um, the more conventionally religious you are, the way you narrate your encounter, you start to squeeze the open endedness down, uh,
Yeah.
perhaps to like just having a purpose
Right.
and a drive for
Right.
your life, and and I think that that kind of open endedness there, it in a sense, an event of resonance ends with a benediction.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, I
No,
I
I
had
think that's
not,
right. Yeah.
and it might have just been because it said religion on the cover that then I started
Hmm.
noticing when he goes through his, well, I'm talking to people in a second language. Here's some other words I might use, and I was
Yeah.
like, oh, well, these are all liturgical ones,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, yeah, and it is an interesting. That this will be another interesting conversation we can have at the end of September. Is as theologians, in particular, as people in the practice of ministry, what about Rosa seems the most directly applicable, without trying to be too, uh, kind of directly, yeah, practical. But there, I think there's a practical element here. Is it worship? Does resonance play into how we think about the way we think about worship, or is it? I see. I tend to be more someone who's inspired by Bonhoeffer, and I think a lot of what Rose is getting at is this encounter with personhood and the way relationality becomes this place that can hold this deep transformational dynamic. So, how do we even think about the practice of ministry around resonance? Is it really most directly applicable to how we think about the way we set up worship space, or what we think is happening in worship, or do we think about what happens in pastoral care encounters, or what happens in certain kind of ways we engage with our neighbors in the world? Like, how do we think about that? I think will be an interesting way to see how these different theologians, yeah, kind of mobilize those ideas for the life of the church.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that um that it, at least I'm rather interested in is how his theory pushed back to the kind of iconoclastic tendency of Protestantism.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it, I've I, I've kind of thought of like his these two ideas functioning as a kind of diagnosis for a spiritual deficit disorder in modernity, because you take Protestantism and this kind of iconoclastic energy, right? For you transform time, you transform relations, there's this, you're removing of images, aesthetics. It's a turn towards where the emergence of kind of the ethics of belief, where now the individual has to like know why they believe what they believe, and that's the justification that
Hmm.
used to function as like trust and faith. All that kind of energy, you combine that with the the kind of bifurcation of nature, scientism, where uh, the accounts of the world are the ones that help us control it. And as you do that, that modernity's drive for acceleration essentially starts to cut off plausibility structures for resonance. At the
Hmm.
same time, Protestantism's religious energy is to cut off plausibility structures for resonance that aren't under the places it controls doctrinally. And
Yeah,
so you end up with a million different denominations that are the true biblical ones, and you have
yeah.
a reductive scientism. And Peter Harrison's newest book draws the connection between like that literalist reading emerges first in Protestantism for reading the Bible, and then scientists pick it up for reading nature. And I think that is a kind of sets up for a
Interesting.
real spiritual deficit disorder, like much akin to. I thought of this because in July I got to spend 3 weeks out in the middle of the high desert. One week at Ring Lake Ranch has no light pollution. Like they only have lights outdoor at night. Now, when you look at the sky at 1 a.m. and it's completely clear and there is zero light pollution, you just realize that you haven't seen the night sky.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like you were describing earlier of like parents, when you're outside the whirlpool, you're like, oh, I hope this doesn't end poorly, right? But if you're in it, that's the only thing you can pay attention to. The frenetic energy there doesn't even allow you to think about anything else or how you get out or how we're going to handle this. You just hope it
Right.
doesn't collapse. And the same with like sound pollution. Think of how much more noise exists, because there's always constant noise in so many places. And then when you get to genuine silence, there's like a whole nother dimension of existence that you just have never attended to because the energy's just there. And I think that that kind of Protestant iconoclastic religious energy and scientism generates a kind of spiritual deficit, where just like noise or light pollution, it's a spiritual pollution,
Yeah.
where then you go around with like, I can't resonate anywhere. And part of the subversiveness, I think, of his theory of resonance, and when he's addressing different religious traditions and communities, is it's kind of like keep the liturgy weird.
Hmm.
And not because like the Protestant end of it is ultimate, right? Like the particular confessional expression of the ideas that you're now going to justify yourself in some kind of like modern logic. But the space that's generated
Mm-hmm.
by time, tradition, rhythms, and narratives that do not understand how to tell you to relate to the world like modernity is genuinely
Yeah.
a gift. It's like one of the times Brueggemann was on the podcast when he was talking about the gift of Torah to Moses, and he goes, "Yeah, well, because they were under a different law already, and it was called build more bricks, and then
Yeah.
build more bricks with less straw, and if you don't, we're going to kill somebody." And so, like, if you understand that, then there's a whole nother agenda, and Sabbath is at the heart of it, and
Yeah.
God celebrates it. It's a different orientation altogether.
Yeah. Which I think takes us full circle to the back to dynamic stabilization, because what I do find interesting in, this is part of the Taylor conversation too, about disenchantment and what Rose is trying to do. What I've heard him say he's kind of trying to do at a big theoretical level is try to synthesize in some ways Max Weber and Karl Marx in their own way, in a kind of different kind of perspective. So the way money and particularly capital works as a form of kind of continued acceleration. He's kind of taking that from Marx. But this disenchantment, I think he thinks that dynamic stabilization, what it does is it makes this, every society needs a stabilization system. What the modern project has done is make the stabilization system outside of the cult, outside of worship itself. So even as you kind of reference Brueggemann and in Egypt, like that was a stabilization system that was built on the cult. We needed to have multiple temples everywhere, because if your society is going to be stable, then the gods have to look on you well, and the only way the gods can look on you well is if you give them more of your energy and more of your sacrifice and more of this to stabilize it. And it was the king's job to stabilize it by controlling the temple. But one of the things that modernity does, thanks to Protestantism, and Protestantism doing this at the end of the medieval period, or ending the medieval period, is to upend the cult as a dynamic stabilization system, and then they go with a dynamic one, and a dynamic one becomes capital is more important than cult. And I think Rose is trying to kind of get at that. So this this not being attentive to the ways the world speaks, the way God speaks, the way that you're in a living, moving world that's full of these deep forms of relationship, becomes the byproduct really of this modern need to have our stabilization system be embedded more in capital than in the cult, or a kind of different kind of form. So that becomes a big question for us if we are at the end of the modern epoch, of what kind of stabilization system can you have. Like you can really only be postmodern as a society, at least structurally, when you find another stabilization system. You will
Yeah.
always be modern if your stabilization remains to be dynamic. It's got to grow or it can't last. It's got to innovate for the sake of more growth. Then you're still modern. And so we will really be at the end of modernity when we find stabilization systems that are outside of that. And can that start to happen with smaller communities? Does that happen with religious communities? I mean, that's a whole kind of open conversation for us to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, actually, that's really helpful. Like because uh, in a sense, dynamic stabilization that generates alienation, aggression, um, it would it it ends up setting up us to have like a kind of declaration of independence from nature, history, community, tradition, the body, uh, convention, and things that are inherited, and so then, like, where does the control come from? Well, the migration of, like, the moment you're alienated and independent from these things, then the binding sovereign becomes the autonomous individual, and you
Mm-hmm.
become subject to competing sovereignties, just like, you know, like a bunch of Greek deities battling it out and getting jealous and whipping each other up and can't imagine, life otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah,
All
absolutely.
right, I'm gonna write this down. Think about it, Andy. I like that. That made me excited.
We're not going to wrestle now, are we?
All right, we don't have to wrestle. We don't have to wrestle. We just got to get an above ground pool
There
and
we
be
go.
like, Heart, We got an idea for you.
Right in Stewart Hall there at
Yep.
Princeton, we can get
I bet they
one of
haven't
those
done that.
pools. Yeah, I bet they haven't either, and I bet they would. I bet they'd be really into that. I bet
Yeah.
that idea would go over really well.
Will you just call Kate over at the Bart
Yeah,
Center and say, "Look, Tripp and I have an idea. It's actually more
right,
mine than Tripp's because I told him I'm sure we can make it happen,
right,
and it might even make Tripp appreciate Karl Barth more." Um, what we need is a kiddie pool for a demonstration.
right.
We're gonna do a podcast in a kiddie pool while going in circles, and every time a
Yeah,
guest comes in, we also are avoiding electrocution with our microphones, and they all have to just start walking in circles, you know?
right. Yeah, yeah, and we'll see who survives.
Yeah, and it is really uncontrollable.
It
Like, you
is
don't know
really
what's going to happen.
uncontrollable.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I have plenty of other things I'd like to talk about, but we'll talk about them in person at Princeton in September. You can check the link in the chat. If you're listening or watching this later, I'll put the link there. And if people are interested in reading some of your own engagement with Rosa or
Yeah.
reading Rosa for the first time, what kind of suggestions do you have?
Yeah, I think probably a place to start is the Congregation in the Secular Age, and then maybe Churches in the Crisis of the Climb. Those Rosa is yeah, pretty significant dialogue partner in those two books.
And what's your normal first if people are asking about reading Rosa?
Yeah, I think probably you know what I would say is dip into the uncontrollability of the world first. That's the yeah, it's about 120 pages in if that does it for you, then you can get into some of the bigger pieces. But the uncontrollability of the world, I think, is a good place to start.
Yeah, yeah. And a new book's a lot of fun, but the one of the things, if you haven't read it,
Yeah.
Charles Taylor's little bitty preface at the beginning gives a beautiful 6-page summary of Rosa's project,
Oh
and
yeah.
I bet it felt good. Like the
Yeah.
guy he wrote a dissertation on wrote a preface,
Yeah.
which was concise and clear enough that he had to actually taken the time to read your book and understand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like a little.
Yeah.
It's
Because
like
we've all read those prefaces where it's like this person didn't read this book.
this. Is this a blog post that was
Right,
repurposed?
right,
They're like, I like the title of this book, and this person
right.
is an
And
acquaintance of mine
right.
that
And this title reminds me of something I wrote earlier that I want to tell you about. Yeah.
yeah. But there you go. This has been fun, Andy, and I hope we all
Thanks, Trip.
get to hang out with y'all in person, online in September.